The violin sat on a folding table near the back of the church hall between a box of mismatched candlesticks and a stack of water-damaged cookbooks nobody had opened. The case was cracked along one hinge, repaired with electrical tape that had gone brittle and started to peel. A handwritten card propped against it read Antique Violin, Estate Lot, $40 firm. Nobody had touched it all morning. And then Everett Callaway, the founder and principal appraiser of Callaway Heritage Auctions, the most respected name in estate liquidation between Ottawa and Halifax, walked past it on his way to examine a Georgian writing desk on the far side of the room, glanced down at the man crouching beside the table with a small penlight in his hand, and stopped just long enough to say what he said in a voice that carried cleanly through the low-ceilinged space. "Don't waste your time on that. It's a factory reproduction. Mass-produced, probably Czech, probably post-war. The finish alone tells you everything you need to know." The man crouching beside the table did not look up immediately. He kept the penlight angled at the interior of the scroll, just above the peg box, reading something that only he could see from that angle. His name was Hugh Decker, and he was 43 years old, and he was wearing the kind of jacket that suggests a person has been doing physical work for long enough that he has stopped thinking about what he wears to do it. When he finally straightened, it was without hurry, and he met Callaway's eyes with an expression that gave nothing away. "I appreciate the input," Hugh said. Callaway moved on. His junior appraiser, a careful young woman named Simone Beauchamp, who had been following 2 steps behind with a clipboard, lingered a moment longer than she needed to. She looked at the violin, then at Hugh, then looked away. What Hugh Decker saw in that violin that a room full of estate professionals missed is worth, as it turned out, considerably more than anyone present was prepared to say out loud. And it begins with a question his daughter had asked him the previous winter, on the drive home from her school concert, when she was 11 years old and still believed her father could fix anything. Hugh Decker loaded his tools into the back seat of his Subaru at 7:15 on a Saturday morning in October, checked the mirrors twice out of habit, and pulled out of the narrow side street in Gatineau where his restoration workshop occupied the lower half of a converted electrical building. The sky was the particular gray of early Canadian autumn, not stormy, just overcast, the kind of morning that smells like wet leaves and wood smoke and reminds you that the cold is coming whether you're ready or not. His son, Owen, 9 years old, wearing the hockey jersey he refused to change out of on weekends, a stuffed dog named Biscuit tucked under his arm, sat in the back seat watching the river through the window with the solemn attention of a child who takes journeys seriously. "What's the best violin in the whole world?" Owen asked, adjusting Biscuit's ear. Hugh considered this the way he always considered Owen's questions, genuinely, which Owen had learned to recognize and appreciate it in the private way that children appreciate things they cannot yet name. "The one that hasn't been heard yet," Hugh said. Owen accepted this without argument and watched the river. 3 years earlier, Hugh had been the principal conservator at the National Arts Center's instrument collection, a position he'd arrived at through 15 years of graduate work and obsessive practical training under luthiers in Montreal and Cremona. His father, Donald Decker, had spent the last 30 years of his life cataloging Canadian instrument provenance, and his particular subject had been the workshop of Edouard Morin, a Quebec luthier who had worked in Montreal between 1908 and 1951 and whose later instruments, made during a specific 18-month period in 1938 and 1939, when Morin had returned briefly from a year in Italy, were considered by the small community of people who knew enough to care to be among the finest bowed instruments ever produced on Canadian soil. Most of them had been lost to time, sold separated from their provenance, refinished beyond recognition, or simply destroyed. Donald Decker had believed until his death 4 years ago that at least one of the 1938 instruments might still exist somewhere unrecognized, in exactly the kind of place where nobody thought to look. Hugh's wife Karen had died of cancer 2 years after Donald. Owen had been 7. Hugh had left the NA 6 months after that, not because the work was beyond him, but because a conservation lab in Ottawa and a 9-year-old in Gatineau are not the same time zone in any sense that matters, and Owen needed his father in the same building, not across a river. He opened the restoration workshop. He learned which lunch foods Owen would actually eat. He kept his father's research notebooks on the shelf above his workbench. Today he was driving to a church hall estate sale in Aylmer, the kind of event organized by families who need to clear a house quickly and don't know what they have. He was not there for the furniture or the silverware. He was there for anything with strings, anything tucked in the back of a box, anything the organizers had priced without knowing what they were pricing. He parked on the street, signed Owen into the supervised activity room that the church hall kept near the entrance for exactly this kind of event, a room with folding chairs and a table of coloring books. kissed the top of his son's head, and walked into the main hall with his penlight in his jacket pocket and his father's voice somewhere behind his eyes. The hall was already busy. Families moved through the aisles with the particular absorbed attention of people looking for something useful and cheap. Hugh moved along the edges, reading price tags methodically, pausing at a crate of old orchestral music scores and a case of brass fittings that turned out to be from a 1960s Eaton's catalog instrument, and then he turned toward the back of the room and stopped. The violin was on a folding table between the candlesticks and the cookbooks, as though whoever had placed it there had been making decisions quickly and had run out of categories. The case was damaged. The instrument itself had been re-varnished at some point incompetently with something that had gone slightly orange and obscured the original finish, and the pegs had been replaced with modern friction pegs that didn't belong to the instrument's period. At a glance, it looked like everything Everett Callaway had said it was. Hugh crouched and aimed the penlight at the scroll. The fluting was wrong for Czech factory work. Not wrong badly, wrong precisely. The curve of the volute was cut freehand by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to deviate slightly from the standard template in a way that was consistent and intentional. It was the kind of deviation that a machine couldn't make and a student wouldn't dare. He was still in that position when the footsteps stopped nearby. Everett Callaway looked at him with the polite, efficient appraisal of someone who had already moved on mentally and was only pausing out of professional courtesy. He delivered his opinion about the Czech reproduction and walked away. Simone Beauchamp lingered a moment. A man in a pressed flannel shirt, broad-shouldered, late 50s, the kind of ease that comes from many years of buying low, looked at the violin from across the aisle with the quick, practiced glance of a man sorting through a clearance rack and moved on without stopping. His name was Gordon Stanhope, and he had been buying and reselling estate lots across the Ottawa Valley for 20 years. The violin did not hold his attention for more than 4 seconds. Through the open doorway to the activity room, Hugh could see Owen standing at the threshold with Biscuit under his arm, watching his father across the hall. Hugh gave him a small nod. Owen disappeared back inside. Hugh stood, put the penlight in his pocket, and walked to the registration table. The bidding was informal, managed by a retired schoolteacher named Miss Archambault, who was running the sale on behalf of the estate family and was doing so with the cheerful, slightly harassed efficiency of someone organizing a thing they had never organized before. The violin was listed in the flat-rate table section, not the auction items. $40 firm, available all morning. Hugh bought it. He paid cash. Mrs. Archambault put the money in a tin box and handed him a handwritten receipt. Simone Beauchamp was passing nearby when the transaction completed. She slowed slightly, not obviously, just a fraction of a second, and her eyes moved from the violin case to Hugh's face and back again with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally curious. "It's probably nothing," Hugh said quietly, not quite to her. "Probably," she said, and walked on. Owen was waiting at the activity room door with Biscuit on his shoulder, watching the volunteers carry the violin case to Hugh's car with the focused interest of a child who has learned that his father notices things other people walk past. "Is it a good one?" Owen asked. "I don't know yet," Hugh said. "Get in." He buckled Owen in, looked in the rearview mirror at the case in the back seat, and drove home across the river. He worked alone in the workshop that evening after Owen was asleep. The overhead lights turned the room clean and white, and Hugh moved around the instrument in the slow, methodical approach his father had taught him, starting with the exterior and working inward, cataloging before concluding. The re-varnish was the first obstacle, and he worked around its edges with a solvent-dampened cotton swab, testing at the heel of the neck at where an old repair had lifted slightly and created a margin. Beneath the orange overlay in the exposed seam, the original finish was visible, dark amber, with a depth that did not come from a bottle. He photographed it. Then he photographed the scroll from 8 angles. Then he turned the instrument over and aimed the penlight through the F-hole. The label inside was partially obscured by a later repair patch, but the letter forms of what remained were visible along the upper edge. Handwritten, in a compact, slightly forward-leaning French script. He could read 4 letters and a partial numeral. He did not make a sound. He held the light steady and read what was there 3 times. His father had described the labeling convention in a paper he'd published in 1997 in the Journal of the Canadian Musical Instruments Society, in a passage Hugh had read so many times he could reconstruct it from memory without trying. The Morin instruments from the 1938-39 period bear a distinctive label script, compact and forward-leaning, characteristic of the maker's hand in that decade. The numeral following the maker's name indicates position in the production sequence of that period. Only 11 instruments are confirmed. The 12th, if it exists, would bear the numeral 12. Hugh withdrew the penlight, sat down on his work stool, and breathed. He reached for his phone and called a number he hadn't used in 18 months. Dr. Adèle Fontaine was 67 years old, retired from the Faculty of Music History at the Université de Montréal, and the foremost living authority on Quebec instrument making between 1880 and 1960. She had known Donald Decker for 30 years and had attended his funeral. She and Hugh had spoken several times in the years since, always about the research, always with the particular formality of two people who share a subject but are still calibrating how well they know each other. When Hugh called at 8 in the morning on the second day, he did not explain the full situation. He described 4 things: the scroll profile, the original varnish color, the label script, and the partial numeral. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he looked at the phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. "Send me photographs," Dr. Fontaine said. Her voice had become very careful and very quiet. "Everyone you have, right now." Hugh sent 31 images. An hour and 40 minutes later, Dr. Fontaine called back. She had a colleague with her, a retired luthier from Sherbrooke named Michel Audet, who had physically handled 2 of the confirmed Morin instruments and had written the only surviving technical description of their interior construction. Audet went through the photographs without speaking. When he finally spoke, his French was quiet and precise, and Dr. Fontaine translated without being asked. "The bass bar," he said. "The placement and the taper. This is Morin's method in the late period. A factory instrument does not have this. A student instrument does not have this. This is a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had been doing it for 30 years. Dr. Fontaine looked at Hugh through the video screen with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something older and more personal. "If the label confirms what you believe it confirms," she said, "and if the interior construction is consistent with what Michel is describing, then what you have is the 12th Morin, the one your father spent the last decade of his life looking for." Hugh asked the question. "Estimated value?" Dr. Fontaine was quiet for a moment. "Contagion must come before any number," she said. "But I will tell you this carefully. A confirmed Morin from that period in original condition beneath the re-varnish would represent the most significant Canadian instrument find in at least 30 years. At auction, in the current market for instruments of this provenance, conservatively 3 to 4 million, possibly higher, depending on who is in the room." Hugh ended the call. He set the phone face down on the workbench and stood at the window of the workshop for a while, looking out at the street. Across the lane, a neighbor was stacking firewood for winter with the unhurried patience of someone who has done this enough times to stop counting. The trees along the road had gone yellow, and the light coming through them was the particular gold of October in Quebec, low and clear and slightly melancholy. Owen was in the yard beside the workshop, walking Biscuit along the top of the wooden fence railing with the focused narrative precision of a child running a very important story only he could hear. Hugh watched him for a long time, then he turned back to the workbench. The car Hugh didn't recognize appeared outside the workshop on the morning of the 4th day, a late model pickup with Alberta plates, idling in a way that suggested it was waiting rather than going. Gordon Stanhope came through the open workshop door at 9:15 without knocking, which was not a surprise because men like Gordon Stanhope did not knock on the doors of other men's workshops. He had a younger man with him, a nephew, as it turned out, who worked in property law and had been borrowed for the occasion, carrying a folder in a way that was meant to look casual. Gordon looked at the workshop with the practiced calm of someone taking inventory of a room he might have use for. He looked at the violin on the stand near the workbench with the stillness of a man who has spent 2 days on the phone regretting 4 seconds of inattention. "I was at the Aylmer sale Saturday," Gordon said. "I think we were looking at the same piece." "You might have been," Hugh said. "You kept walking." Gordon smiled in a way that acknowledged this without conceding it. "Things move fast at those sales. I came to ask if you'd consider a private sale before you go any further with it." The nephew opened the folder. A number was printed at the top, handwritten in the particular way that suggests it was composed carefully and is meant to appear generous. $180,000, conditional on authentication. Hugh looked at the number. He looked at Gordon. "No," he said. Gordon paused. He was a man who had conducted transactions for a long time and had developed an instinct for the pause that follows a first refusal. Whether it was the opening position, whether it contained a counter, whether it was going to hold. He read the pause Hugh gave him accurately. It was going to hold. "The estate family," Gordon said, with the measured tone of someone raising a question he has rehearsed, "may not have been fully informed about what they were consigning. There are legal instruments that can revisit a sale if the represented value and the actual value are substantially different." The nephew shifted his weight very slightly. Hugh set down the cloth he'd been holding and looked at Gordon with an expression that was not combative and was not frightened. The item was priced and sold on a flat-rate table with no auction representation and no warranty of value. I paid the asking price. Mrs. Archambault issued a receipt. He paused. I reviewed the estate sale terms on the church hall's posted consent form before I bought anything. The sale is complete. The nephew stopped shifting. His stillness was more informative than his movement had been. Owen appeared in the interior doorway that connected the workshop to the house stairs, biscuit under his arm, wearing his hockey jersey, looking at the men with the straightforward curiosity of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise interest as disinterest. Gordon glanced at Owen. He looked back at Hugh, and when he looked back, his expression had shifted in a way that Hugh recognized and did not acknowledge. 250,000, Gordon said. Final. Hugh looked toward the doorway. Owen, he said in a voice that was completely steady, go upstairs, please. The sound of footsteps on the stairs, the door at the top closing. Hugh looked at Gordon Stanhope. You should leave, he said quietly. Now, before I make a phone call. Gordon left. He stopped at the door and turned back once, not to speak, only to look at the violin on the stand near the workbench, still in its damaged case, still wearing the wrong varnish, still entirely unremarkable to anyone who had not looked carefully enough and long enough to see what was underneath. His expression was not the expression of a man who had given up. It was the expression of a man who was revising his approach. Hugh waited until the pickup with the Alberta plates had turned the corner, then picked up his phone. We need to move the timeline forward, he told Dr. Fontaine. Adele Fontaine drove from Montreal the following morning in her old Volvo, a detail Hugh noticed with a private recognition. Arriving at the Gatineau workshop at 9:30, with a soft-sided equipment case and a satchel of documents that she carried with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to transporting things that cannot be replaced. She came through the open roll-up door and stopped inside, looking at the violin from across the room. She did not immediately approach. She stood at the threshold for a moment, in the manner of someone who has been moving towards something for a very long time, and is not in a rush now that they have arrived. Then she set her bags down and walked toward the workbench slowly, and when she reached it, she put on the cotton gloves she removed from her kit with the automatic precision of long habit. She lifted the instrument from the stand and turned it in her hands without speaking. She examined the scroll. She examined the F-holes. She tilted it toward the window and looked through the opening at the label. When she spoke, her voice was in French first before she caught herself. Your father described this label in his '97 paper, she said. I read it 3 times when it was published. I thought he was right then, and I thought we would never find what he was looking for. She was not talking to Hugh. She was talking to the instrument or to a version of the room that had existed 25 years before. The authentication took 4 hours. Fontaine worked with Michel Audet on video, talking through each point as she examined it, cross-referencing her findings against the documents she had brought. A complete photographic record of the 2 confirmed Morin instruments she had personally catalogued, Donald Decker's original research notes, a set of workshop records recovered from a Montreal estate in 2009 that had never been fully published. The scroll geometry matched. The varnish, where it was original, matched. The interior construction matched what Audet described from memory, from the 2 instruments he had held, and then Dr. Fontaine found something that even Hugh had not found, because finding it required knowing that it existed and knowing exactly where Edouard Morin had chosen to put it. In the upper interior of the back plate, where the spruce meets the maple at the center joint, there was a small mark pressed into the wood with a tool, not visible without proper lighting and proper expectation, a single letter M, and below it in smaller characters the numeral 12. Dr. Fontaine held the instrument with both hands and said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady in the way that voices become steady when the emotion behind them is large enough that it has passed beyond the range where it makes your voice shake. He numbered them, she said. Edouard numbered them himself. Your father believed he did. He wrote about it. Nobody was certain. She set the instrument down on the cloth with the care of someone setting down something that belongs to more people than the person in the room. Owen had come downstairs at some point during the last hour and was standing in the doorway between the house and the workshop, biscuit on his shoulder, watching the old woman at the workbench with the grave attention of a child who understands, without being told, that something important is happening. By 4 in the afternoon, Dr. Fontaine had signed the formal authentication certificate. The document stated, in the precise language of someone who had spent a career preparing to write exactly this kind of sentence, that the instrument examined was confirmed to be the 12th and final violin produced in Edouard Morin's late period, the only unconfirmed example now confirmed, bearing the maker's own interior numbering. and that its fair market value in the current international instrument auction market was estimated conservatively between $3 million and $4,500,000, with the potential for a substantially higher realized price given the historical uniqueness of the find. Dr. Fontaine shook Hugh's hand at the workshop door and held it a moment before letting go. "Your father would have been very quiet about this," she said. "In the good way, I know," Hugh said. She looked at Owen, who had come to stand beside his father in the doorway. "And who is this?" she asked. "Owen," the boy said, "and this is Biscuit." Dr. Fontaine looked at the stuffed dog with the gravity it was owed. "Biscuit," she said. "A very good name." She got in her Volvo and drove west toward the highway. Hugh went inside and called Callaway Heritage Auctions. The call moved through 2 assistants before it reached Everett Callaway directly, which was not the normal route for an unsolicited inbound, and the fact that it reached him at all suggested that news travels quickly in small professional communities. Callaway answered with the measured efficiency of a man managing a full schedule, and Hugh said what needed to be said without building toward it. He was in possession of the 12th Morin, formally authenticated by Dr. Adele Fontaine and corroborated by Michel Audet. He wished to sell it through Callaway Heritage in a dedicated single-lot session. He wanted to discuss terms. The silence that followed was longer than a processing pause. "The piece from the Elmer sale?" Callaway said. "Yes," Hugh said. Another silence, the sound of something being set down. "I'll need to see the authentication documents directly," Callaway said. "I'll also want a call with Dr. Fontaine at your convenience." "She's expecting your call," Hugh said. "She said to reach her before 7. There was something in Callaway's voice when he spoke again, not quite different but changed in texture, a quality that had been present in their previous encounter, an automatic authority, a certain altitude that was no longer quite there. "We'll schedule it for Thursday," Callaway said. "A dedicated session. We'll handle all preparation and promotion from our end." "Thank you," Hugh said and ended the call. That evening, Owen sat on the high stool beside the workbench while Hugh worked on a rented viola that needed its soundpost repositioned, a routine job, the kind of work that fills the weeks between the remarkable ones and pays for everything. "Are you selling the church sale violin?" Owen asked. "Yes," Hugh said without looking up. "Why?" "You just got it." Hugh set down the soundpost setter and thought about how to answer in the way that was true and manageable for a 9-year-old. "Because something like that doesn't belong to just one person," he said. "It needs to go somewhere it'll be taken care of, properly, heard properly." Owen thought about this. "Like when we give books to the library," he said. Hugh looked at his son. "Exactly like that," he said. Owen seemed satisfied. He watched his father work until his head started dipping, and Hugh carried him to bed without waking him and came back downstairs to finish the soundpost. Callaway Heritage sent the announcement on Wednesday evening. By Thursday morning, 3 international music publications had run pieces on it. The Canadian press had picked up a brief from one of them. 6 registered bidders from Europe and Japan had confirmed remote access. The main room at the Callaway Heritage Gallery in Ottawa had more people in it by mid-morning than it typically saw at its flagship spring sales. Hugh drove across the river in the same Subaru. Owen sat in the back with Biscuit in his lap, dressed in his good sweater over the hockey jersey, which was the compromise they had negotiated. Hugh wore a gray shirt and dark trousers, no suit. Nothing that would make him unrecognizable to anyone who had seen him crouching in a church hall with a penlight 5 days ago. He parked, took Owen's hand, and walked through the main entrance. People noticed them. Not because of what Hugh was wearing. Because his name was at the top of the announcement, and several of the collectors and dealers in the lobby had the particular alertness of people who have recently been asked to revise an assumption. Simone Beauchamp met them at the door with 2 access lanyards. She crouched to Owen's eye level. "What's your name?" she asked. "Owen," he said. "This is Biscuit." She smiled the way people smile when they're not performing it and led them to the seller's waiting area, a quiet room with upholstered chairs and a window overlooking the street below. Gordon Stanhope was already in the bidding room when Hugh walked through before the session started. Seated at the far end of the second row, arms crossed with the expression of a man who has accepted an outcome he dislikes and is choosing to witness it anyway, he had registered to bid. Hugh noted this and said nothing. Dr. Fontaine was in the front row, her document case on the seat beside her, watching the violin which had been placed on a low wooden stand at the front of the room. Cleaned carefully, stripped of the orange re-varnish with patient professional work, the original amber finish now visible and honest and far older than anyone in the room, except the woman who had authenticated it. She watched it with the patient attention of someone sitting beside a very old friend who has been a long time in arriving. Everett Callaway stepped to the podium. The room settled. He introduced the lot with the precise historical language the authentication documents provided, reading from prepared notes with the focused attention of a man who had clearly spent time with the material the previous evening, and then he opened the bidding at $1 million. $1 million became $2 million in the first 20 seconds, 3 phone lines moving simultaneously from the remote bidders. $2 million became $2,000,008 before 30 seconds had elapsed. Gordon Stanhope raised his paddle at $3 million with the bearing of a man who knows he is probably not going to win and has chosen to participate anyway, which is its own kind of dignity. The numbers climbed past him, 3-2 from a screen, 3-8 from a Japanese collector on video, 4 million from Stanhope, 4-3 from the screen. Gordon set his paddle down. Calloway's voice was steady, 4,300,000, going once. No movement from the screens. Hugh was standing along the side wall, one hand resting lightly on Owen's shoulder. The boy didn't understand the numbers, they were too large, too abstract outside any scale that connected to his daily life. But he was watching his father's face with the careful attention of a child who has learned that the most important information in any room is usually in the face of the adult he trusts most. 4,300,000, going twice. The room held. The gavel came down. $4,300,000. The room released. Applause. Movement. The particular murmur of people recalibrating what they've just witnessed. Gordon Stanhope stood, buttoned his jacket with the deliberate calm of a man managing a public loss with whatever dignity remains available, and walked out through the side door. Dr. Fontaine did not stand. She sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, looking at the violin on its stand. Her eyes had gone bright and wet in the way of someone for whom the moment is simultaneously about the object and about something older than the object. Hugh looked down at Owen. Owen looked up at him. He didn't ask about the number, he put his free hand into his father's, and Biscuit shifted under his other arm, and that was the whole of it. Simone Bosham took Owen to the small room near the side corridor where there was a tablet and cartoons, and Owen went willingly. He was already negotiating with Biscuit about what to watch before the door was halfway closed. Everett Calloway found Hugh in the quieter hallway off the main room, the low-ceilinged passage near the administrative offices where the lighting was warmer and there was nothing to perform for. He came without his assistant, without his notes, without the particular bearing that had characterized every previous interaction between them. He said Hugh's name. Hugh Decker. He said it as one says a name when one is trying to locate what is owed to it. Hugh waited. "What did you see in it?" Calloway asked. Not the professional version of the question, the real one. "The scroll profile," Hugh said. "The fluting was cut freehand. The deviation was intentional and consistent. A factory instrument doesn't make that deviation. A craftsman who has been doing it for 30 years makes that deviation because he's stopped following the template and started following the wood." Calloway looked at him steadily. "You saw that from across the table." "I saw enough to be suspicious from across the table," Hugh said. "I needed the penlight to be certain." Something moved through Calloway's expression, not the managed professional shift of someone adjusting their position, but the involuntary reorganization of a person absorbing a specific weight. "I said what I said in front of a number of people," Calloway said. "Not an apology yet, a precise accounting." "You did," Hugh said. "Your son was in the building." "Owen's heard a lot of things," Hugh said. His voice was neither cold nor particularly forgiving. It was simply honest, the way honest sometimes sounds when it doesn't need anything from the other person. "He's learning that being right and being believed aren't the same thing. I think that's worth knowing early." Calloway looked at Hugh for a moment, then, "Your father, he was the researcher." "Yes. He spent the last 10 years of his life looking for the 12th Moran. He didn't find it, and you?" Hugh glanced toward the side corridor where Owen was watching his cartoons. "I have a son," he said simply. "The work is how I take care of that the right way." Calloway stood for a moment in the stillness of someone who has heard something that requires no addition. "I'll have a written acknowledgement sent to you," he said. "Regarding what I said in the hall, that's your choice to make," Hugh said. Not dismissively, as a statement of fact about whose choice it was. "It isn't necessary." He gave Calloway a quiet nod and turned to collect his son. 2 weeks passed. Hugh did not move the workshop. He did not buy a new car. He did not change the sign on the front of the building or update the website or tell anyone outside the small circle who already knew. He opened a registered education savings account for Owen at the credit union on Rue Principale and deposited a significant sum into it, structured so that it would be Owen's when Owen needed it, with no conditions attached to any of the options it would give him. He kept the remainder in a business account and made arrangements to add proper climate control to the storage room, which he had been meaning to do for 3 years, and to bring in a part-time assistant 2 days a week, which would let him stop working Sundays alone. The sign on the building did not change. The same parts calendar was still on the wall. The same coffee maker with the handle he'd meant to replace was still on the shelf in the corner. Dr. Fontaine came by once more before returning to Montreal, pulling up in the Volvo with a flat package wrapped in brown paper under her arm. Inside was a photograph, black and white, archival quality, printed from a negative she had found in the papers donated to the university after Donald Decker's death. It showed a workshop, probably Montreal, probably 1939, from the quality of the light. Two men were standing beside a workbench. One of them was Edard Morin, younger than Hugh had pictured him, in a work apron with his sleeves rolled up. The other man was looking at the camera with a slight squint, holding a violin in the way of someone who knew how to hold one. On the back, in Donald Decker's handwriting, compact, slightly left-leaning, Dr. Fontaine had added a single line below the caption, "For the man who found what your father was looking for." Hugh hung it on the wall above the workbench, between a diagram of French-style bass bar fitting he'd drawn himself years ago and a photograph of his father at a conference in Quebec City, standing beside a display case and grinning at something off-camera. On a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the sale, Hugh was on his back under a cello that needed its end-pin mechanism rebuilt, an ordinary job for a student orchestra in Gatineau, when Owen climbed onto the high stool and began arranging biscuit on top of the tool cabinet with architectural seriousness. "What are you doing today?" Owen asked. Looking at an instrument, Hugh said from under the cello. "Is it a good one?" "I don't know yet." "Still looking." Owen considered this. "Like the church sale one," he said. "Like the church sale one," Hugh agreed. Owen nodded and returned to Biscuit's arrangement. That evening, while he was shutting off the workshop lights, his phone buzzed on the bench. An unfamiliar number, but the initials at the bottom of the message were clear enough. "I owe you a proper apology, not for the result but for the manner. I made a judgment in front of people without the evidence to support it, and I knew in the moment that I was doing it. I'm sorry for that." E.C. Hugh read it once, then once more. He typed a reply. "Thank you for writing it. HD." He set the phone down and stood for a moment in the dark of the workshop before going upstairs. The street light outside threw a long band of light across the floor, and in it the cello lay on the cloth where he'd left it, the end-pin housing open, the mechanism waiting for tomorrow. Nothing remarkable, nothing hidden, just an instrument that needed work. He looked at it for a moment anyway. The habit was too old to break and too useful to want to. His father had given it to him early, the habit of staying with a thing long enough to find out whether it was what it appeared to be, because ordinary and unremarkable are descriptions of first glances, and first glances are only the beginning. There are instruments in church halls and back rooms and estate tables all over this country that nobody has looked at carefully in decades. There are things priced at $40 that contain the life's work of someone who put everything they knew into a piece of maple and spruce and believed, with the quiet faith of a craftsman, that it would eventually find a person who could hear it. Most things wait a long time. Most things are never found, but some of them are, by the person who knows what to look for and why, and who was taught by someone who never stopped looking themselves. Not because they were lucky, because the looking was something they were given, and they kept it, and they passed it on.